guys again for joining. For those who are here yesterday, just a quick reminder, I'm Morgan Krupetsky. I lead institutional capital markets ecosystem growth at Avalanche. Joining me today, we have a treat. We have Keerthi Moudgal, head of product for Onyx Digital Assets, which is JP Morgan's blockchain platform for tokenized assets and digital asset exchange. For those who might not be familiar, JP Morgan is the largest bank in the US, and Keerthi was really instrumental in launching the firm's ODA platform back in 2020, alongside its first application for intraday financing, which I'm sure we will get into. Keerthi's primary focus now centers around really scaling ODA by driving its strategic direction and product roadmap across now 3 live applications, and several others I'm sure in the pipeline. She's been part of JP Morgan's blockchain program since 2018, after which she worked at the firm's security services division. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have you, Keerthi, joining us today. Thank you so much for coming all the way down to
Thrilled
Argentina.
to be here. Thanks for having me.
I think this is such a unique opportunity for us to be able to really get kind of an inside view into how TradFi is approaching blockchain and digital asset transformation, and then really to hear from you from Onyx and JP Morgan, who I really would consider kind of one of the most progressive banks in the space in terms of driving things forward. You guys have been at this for quite some time. So maybe just to start and to level set, I'd love to kind of start by getting an overview of what is the ODA platform, both from like an underlying infrastructure standpoint as well as from an application standpoint, like business capabilities. Give us a sense of like the traction, the types of transactions that are flowing through the platform today, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, that sounds good. Actually, maybe it makes sense to just like also take a step back and talk about like what Onyx is, because some of you might be like, this is JP Morgan, like what is the word Onyx? Like what does it mean? So Onyx is a brand that was started back in 2020 to really house all of JP Morgan's blockchain-based offerings under one umbrella, and actually grew out of 4 years of work prior. So like JP Morgan's actually had a presence / team focused in on the space since 2015. Trying to like understand, you know, we have like a payments business, we have a debt capital markets business, we have an asset management business. Like if you think about the expansive set of offerings that the bank has and the clients that we touch, there are a wide variety of problem statements that could potentially be addressed by blockchain. So the effort goes way back. In 2020, there were, I think, 2 products that had been launched. And the firm was like, we should stand up the investment and the team that's required to actually like industrialize and scale these offerings. So then with that, we started Onyx, and then under Onyx, there are basically like 2 sides of the house. There's a payment side, and then a digital asset side. So ODA, or Onyx Digital Assets, is our digital assets platform. We run a private fork of Ethereum and have a number of different applications that serve various lines of business within the bank. So for instance, we have a financing application where clients can tokenize assets and raise capital from JP Morgan on an intraday basis as opposed to potentially like overnight. A collateral application where clients are able to tokenize their assets and then use them as collateral and transfer them with more precision than they potentially have in traditional settlement venues. And then in April, yes, we launched a bond issuance application, all again on the same platform and ecosystem. And I think just to like round out that like introduction to ODA, like the overall problem statement that we are trying to address is effectively across a variety of different asset classes, there are just fundamental inefficiencies because settlement infrastructure is like quite fragmented. And when you get into the specifics of like a treasury versus a money market fund versus like a private equity fund, like that problem statement could get like exacerbated, but ultimately like the patterns remain quite similar across different asset classes. So we were like, we're able to stand up this platform and bring different assets and functionalities all into one place, then potentially you could drive much more capabilities for creating new products, new markets, so on and so forth. And then, sorry, last part to answer that question was you asked about like volume. So since 2020, we've processed around like 1.5 trillion of trade notional to date. It's a long answer, sorry.
Not at all. So I appreciate that you kind of like laid out 3 different examples. Let's just just to kind of take forward one of those examples, if we hone in on the intraday repo app, which is called digital financing, would love to kind of get a sense of specifically like what is the problem statement that is trying to solve? Like what does the process look like or can't look like today? How does the app kind of address those pain points for your clients? And who are the types of clients that are using that platform? And yeah, tell us a little bit more about that in particular.
Yeah, for sure. So, this was the first application that we launched, and it started around a problem statement for enabling clients to access intraday financing. So, if you didn't know, if you are a client of a bank, if you need cash for like a couple hours during the day or a couple minutes during the day, the way that you get that is your bank could decide to lend you capital on a completely unsecured basis. So they're like, Morgan, I like you. You get like $20 million.
I like this bank.
Thanks. Yeah, bank with me. No, so that's great, and obviously like allows a lot of like liquidity to flow into the ecosystem. But as a client, you might be like, I don't know if that will always be available to me. Also, if you're a broker dealer, you might have to hold additional capital on your balance sheet to tap into that line of liquidity. And then obviously as the bank, you're like, well, that's unsecured. They're like, there's risk to that, and so I'm only going to lend out a certain amount, and if I potentially wanted to go above that, I'd want to be a little bit more safe in terms of like how I'm going about that. So then if you're a client and you're like, I want to access capital on like, for like a week out or like months out, you're either like taking out a loan or you're able to access like repo markets where effectively like I can give you a set of treasuries, I can give you a certain set of assets, and then you're able to give me cash on the return. And now I have that liquidity and I have secured my financing for it. The thing is, if I wanted to apply that same mechanism for a couple minutes or for a couple hours, it's quite unfeasible in today's traditional like infrastructure. Like it would take me maybe 15 minutes for that wire to cross from like my bank to from your lender's bank to yours. It could take potentially like a day or 2 days for you to settle that asset as collateral. And so what we had decided to do was apply the concept of tokenization to this problem statement and say, if you have certain assets that you're able to then tokenize, and then you structure smart contracts to automate every aspect of that trade once it's agreed, you could potentially create this venue for intraday financing. So now our clients are able to basically do exactly what I described that I won't repeat.
So thank you for that. And kind of as you have identified these problem statements across these 3 different applications, and as you look ahead, I'd love to kind of hear a little bit more about kind of the process of how you guys, especially to your point, there's so many different businesses, so many different areas. How do you guys go about kind of identifying and honing in on, who is that client we want to focus on? What are those pain points? And then how do you decide to therefore like build an app around it? Like take us through that kind of that process and that approach.
Yeah, definitely. For some reason, the clock is like tripping me out. I'm gonna look this way.
Very big numbers.
Yeah. It has actually been quite different from use case to use case. So, like I mentioned, early days, like our sort of like the ethos of our team was very much like, let's sit down with different business lines, really try and understand like what are the problems that they face in servicing their clients today. What are like their objectives as a business in terms of like how they're evolving, and like is there actually a problem here to be solved like with this technology? So some of what we've done, especially like the work in the bonds ecosystem as well as the digital financing work, was very much born of that like in-depth analysis of like what is every single step of the process today of like moving an asset from like one custodian to another, or like executing like every step of a repo transaction and like understanding that in minute detail to then say, yes, there's like something to be solved here. But some of our other use cases have actually come to us from like client requests. For instance, the collateral application that I mentioned, we very much built in partnership-ish with BlackRock. And I think, you know, there it's kind of like if you have a large client that's like knocking on your door and they're like, I want to do XYZ thing. In this case, it was be able to use my money market fund shares as a form of collateral. And I can't do that with your traditional infrastructure. There's like an avenue to like get in there and then really try and understand, like, again, can this tech and can this platform be applied to that particular use case?
And so as you talk to external clients, and then also presumably there's, especially being at an institution, I know this from being at Citi, and I think anybody who's ever worked at a large bank or enterprise really can kind of relate, there's a lot of internal stakeholder buy-in that you have to get across the business and compliance and legal. So when you talk to groups internally and externally that are not necessarily as like blockchain savvy or digital asset savvy, is there, and I'd love for our audience to kind of hear this, like what is the approach that you take in terms of getting buy-in from those types of groups? Presumably you don't really hone in on like deep tech, right? You talk about like business capabilities, but would love to kind of get a sense from you how you guys have really successfully navigated that. And maybe what are some like best practices that you've kind of learned over the years?
Yeah, definitely. I think what's been interesting about our specific team is that we've had to exactly what you say, balance this sort of dynamic of like internally internally to our team being really excited about like the prospect that like of like what the tech can offer to like finance at large, to people at large, versus like what's going to actually resonate with someone who doesn't like think about this technology day in and day out. And to that exact point, I think what has been successful for us is, even though we have this sort of like, I think, shared vision around like what digital assets can bring, it's very much focusing in on like what's the immediate problem that you can solve, like what's actually like, you know, hurting is not the right word, but like what is someone facing, like where is someone facing pain today, and how can you address that like with this solution, as opposed to here's what this technology does and here's like all these like cool bells and whistles. But that being said, I think the one thing that very much does resonate specifically about this tech that we always like speak about is the fact that you're able to like unify all of these different assets onto like one ledger. And that, you know, like anyone who works in like an operations function or a compliance function will like immediately recognize the fact that there are so many issues, especially pertaining to reconciliation, when it comes to like managing multiple different systems for like your cash versus like one asset versus another versus a third. And so I think that like that aspect of it also resonates. But yeah, it's definitely always centering in on the immediate problem, and then sort of like why building on this technology is like future-proofing your solution to enable like much more.
And I sympathize with that, like the idea of just large enterprises in many cases being like the result of years and years of M&A and systems being piled on top of each other and not speaking to each other. And there are implications of that not being kind of using a singular DLT and kind of being able to map out and execute a process end to end. Like I firsthand have felt like the implications of that, and I'm sure again anybody at a large institution or enterprise has felt that as well. What is your view on kind of balancing, and I sympathize also with just like institutions who have probably years and years of tech debt. How do you think about balancing that and potentially either throwing bodies or money at like Band-Aid solutions with, I mean, I don't know if you can like actually rip everything out and kind of replace it with all this tech, but how do you kind of think about the revolutionary capabilities of this technology with like kind of the state of systems as you're basically faced with today?
That's a good question.
Doing the hard-hitting questions at 11 this morning.
I mean,
I have more after the story.
I think in an ideal world, you'd be like yeah, sure, like let's rip everything. Like literally we're like, why don't we just tokenize everything in our like, all of the assets that we have under custody, like tokenize it all and then like enable people to trade on those tokenized assets. No, but I mean, you kind of like balance that then with the reality of like, you know, there's a certain amount of spend that you can apply to the problems that you're trying to solve. And again, like not everything can immediately be solved by this technology. And so I think it's kind of this like weird dance that you end up doing with like each sort of like business stakeholder and each technology stakeholder as to like really, really unpacking like, here's what the value of this solution is and here's why it's important to solve this right now. And then, yeah, kind of like choosing your battles. Yeah.
And choosing your battles.
Choosing
That's definitely a good one. Last question I will ask is, obviously we did work together last year in the context of Monetary Authority of Singapore's Project Guardian, where you know the initiative really required 3 different networks, including the Avalanche network, and demonstrating a degree of interoperability for the Crescendo application, which for those of you who aren't familiar, really was leveraged to kind of demonstrate the use of tokenization for including private market assets in discretionary client portfolios really at scale. Over time, I think there's been a perception of ODA. You mentioned it's being built on private Ethereum. So a lot of people start to call, especially in the DeFi space and the broader tokenization space, they're like, oh, well, JP Morgan's like a walled garden. And like they're never gonna let anybody in, and how are they gonna get mass adoption? So I'm sure you hear that as well. Would love to just get your take in terms of that question, but also kind of how you look at that in the broader context in terms of broader adoption and the future.
Yeah. The timer ran out, but I'll take my time.
We're
with
just
this
gonna keep
talking. Yeah, so I think the project that we did together last year is a really good testament to the fact that we've always thought about ourselves and our platform and our solutions as going beyond like our current operating state, where yes, it is private, it is more of like this walled garden. We are the only like entity that has like deployed applications on the network that we run to date. However, with the project that we did last year, what we wanted to do is basically say like, there will be multiple ecosystems of tokenized assets that come into existence. That is already the case. How can we ensure that we're thinking about solving problems in a way where that reality doesn't result in just like a bunch of like trapped liquidity or fragmented liquidity that replicates the problems of today. And so thinking about, the problem statement like within that project being how do you enable more capital to flow into into private assets, and the approach that we took with model portfolios was very much one where you're like, okay, I'm going to enable the solution on ODA to then connect to different tokenized asset ecosystems on different networks. And I think that sort of like entire exercise really helped ground us in our vision around private assets. And now we are, very much working on productionizing some of the infrastructure that was in place there. And thinking about, again, like how do we, continue to evolve beyond this like walled garden operating state? Is it connecting to other chains? Is it allowing other people to deploy onto our network to be able to like interoperate with our applications, to be able to distribute product, to be able to leverage JP Morgan Cash solutions like on-chain? And very, very forward looking into the future, like is it potentially deploying our assets, our applications into like other ecosystems as well? It's like very central to our conversation internally, but at the same time, it always comes back to like, what is the immediate commercial need? Like what is driving us to make that choice today versus, a year from now or two?
Yeah. And so parting question, especially I think in our audience, if there are teams that are focused on tokenization in some way, shape, or form, or institutional use cases, I think you guys do have like a Web3 kind of, I don't want to say it's like an innovation arm, but yes, an arm that very much engages with like the broader Web3 community. So to that end, would love to just hear from you any advice to those builders who are honing in on this area, how can they either work with you guys or engage with you? What should they be thinking about? Yeah, would love to kind of hear any thoughts you might have there as we wrap up, because there's no more time left.
As it's at 0 seconds. Okay, I'll keep it short. I guess the first is very much talk to us/other institutions. Like, I'm very friendly, and so is our team.
I can attest to that.
Yeah. No, but I think, I feel like more than anything, that's gonna help builders shape the actual like relevance and hone in on the actual like problem that you're looking to solve, and also attest to, is this something that like an institution needs, or maybe there's like a different like target market that as builder you should be going after. And then the second is always to be like problem obsessed, as opposed to potentially like leading with the tech. That being said, like, we're very inquisitive. I will pick apart every aspect of what you're telling me. But it is important to kind of lead with that, like, what are you actually like solving for, as opposed to like, look at this cool thing that I'm doing.
Cool.
But I will also look at the cool thing that you're doing.
All the things.
Yes, I will.
Anyway, thank you so much, Keerthi, for joining us. Really appreciate it. Give Keerthi a round of applause.
Give Morgan a round of applause.
We made it this morning. Thanks, guys. Thank you for joining.